Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Winder, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies at Brown University's Center for Middle East Studies. I'd like to welcome all of you joining by Zoom or watching the live stream on YouTube for our event today, which is part of the New Directions in Palestinian Studies initiative here at Brown. New Directions in Palestinian Studies, or NDPS, has since 2012 worked on various fronts to bring together emerging and established scholars to shape the agenda of knowledge production on Palestine and the Palestinians. It includes a book series launched with the University of California Press, an endowed postdoctoral fellowship dedicated to Palestinian studies, an annual workshop to take stock of research trends and identify promising new questions and sources, and public events such as this one. The goal of all of these different facets of NDPS is to build an international community of scholars dedicated to decolonizing and globalizing the field of Palestinian studies. It's thus appropriate that we come together today to discuss a book entitled Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas between the Anticolonial and the Postcolonial. And we are, of course, thrilled to have with us the author of Decolonizing Palestine, Somdeep Sen. Somdeep Sen is an associate professor in international development studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. His research focuses include spatial politics, race and racism in international relations, liberation movements, settler colonialism, post-colonial studies and migration. And in addition to being the author of Decolonizing Palestine, he is the co-editor of the volume Globalizing Collateral Language from 9/11 to Endless Wars, published by the University of Georgia Press this year. And his work also appears in Foreign Policy, HuffPost, Open Democracy, Jacobin, the London Review of Books, the Palestine Chronicle, and the Disorder of Things. I'll be in conversation with Professor Sen for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for audience questions. You can submit questions at any time by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'll collect those over the course of our conversation, and we'll try to address as many as possible in the time we have. But I want to start off by asking a question that might help give a kind of overarching sense of the book for those who haven't yet had the chance to read it. One of the central concerns of Decolonizing Palestine is the tension for Hamas as the movement that effectively governs inside the Gaza Strip between understanding itself and acting as a liberation movement versus seeing itself and acting as if engaging in a state building project. Or as you put it, between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial, right? So I'm hoping you could say a little bit more about how you came to this project, the kind of backstory, perhaps some of the examples where you saw this tension between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial playing out, and then maybe give a sense of the kind of general argument of the book.
Well, thank you, Alex, and it's great to. It's weird to say be here, but it's great to have this conversation with you. In some ways, the final product of the book came in several stages. So originally, this was my PhD project, and I went into the field, so to speak, with this very political science puzzle. Well, I was told by my supervisor that we're interested in civil-military relations, something that we talk about with regards to a state. And you have Hamas engaging in state-like functions, but also engaging also as an armed faction. So how does a non-state actor balance these two facets of their operational scope? Of course, it was a very traditional mainstream political science department. So I sort of took this sort of very political science way of looking at it. There was no discussion about what is the context in which we're studying this and what is the context in which we are discussing these theoretical frameworks that are usually relevant for, a state and, a sovereign state. Of course, all of that changed when I ended up at the border between Egypt and Gaza, and I talk a little bit about this at the start of my book, where the Egyptian side of the border is heavily armed. You have a tank, as I remember at the time, you had a tank that was pointed towards inward traffic. So the taxi drops you off, and you have the barrel of a tank sort of at you. You have soldiers who were, very angry, and basically Palestinian travelers were largely at the mercy of their whims. When they closed the door, they closed it, or they closed the gate, they closed it, and you really have to just wait in the middle of the desert. Once you go into the Egyptian, this is, mind you, from 2013, 2014, when you enter the Egyptian terminal, it's sort of the same scene where you have you have a PA system with one functional speaker. They're yelling out your name, and if you've been called in, they just sort of throw the passport at you. If you're lucky, they just throw the passport at you, and you go to the Palestinian terminal. If you're not, you get pulled aside, right? So all of this on the Egyptian side really reminded you and forced me to, even though folks back at the department wouldn't be happy about it, who didn't even want me to do field work, I had to take into consideration this political context, and it was very clear. It's the sector of the colonized, as Fennell puts it, right? I mean, it's under siege, and it's very real to you. Except when you take the bus that takes you to the Palestinian side of the terminal, you sort of go under this sign that says, "Welcome to Palestine." And you have this passport control terminal where you had all these rituals of statecraft. And you had a passport control line where the passport control officer would ask you all the questions that are usually asked. And I'm a brown guy who travels a lot, so I get asked these questions a lot. And they were asking me these questions: why are you here? Who invited you? And it was a bizarre experience to me. Also, it was a swanky new terminal funded by the Qataris. So this sort of going through a Egyptian terminal that reminds you that you're in the sector of the colonized, yet you go into the Palestinian terminal that seems like we are in a different era, in the era after the flight of the colonizer, was what I felt. Of course, I didn't vocalize it in that way at the time, but this continued, right? So you would go through, I talk about, a bazaar looking very much like the kind of bazaars I've grown up around in Calcutta, yet on this would seem very normal, yet you would see the pictures of martyrs. You would hear Israeli jets going over, drones going over, even Hamas officials. I went in having read about the Muqawamah, the resistance, hoping to meet some revolutionary figures. Yet my gatekeeper looked at me and said, "You can't go in dressed like that. You need to buy a suit." So I ended up buying a suit to meet Hamas officials who were dressed and engaging in all the rituals of representatives of bureaucrats, yet they were talking about resistance. So of course, aside me being naive, but there is a long history to this, right? So the resistance exists because of overarching settler colonial condition, and the rituals of statecraft were sort of imported in through the Oslo Accords. Now, all the literature that was out there at the time, most of it was too focused on predicting, that had agreed that this was incompatible, these two facets of this organization, and it was focused on predicting when and to what extent Hamas would transition from one role to another. And I of course didn't want to do that, primarily because of the way Hamas officials, as well as Palestinians in Gaza, were talking about these two facets. And they were talking about it, they weren't as stressed about keeping up these two rules as the foreign experts were about these two. So that's when I started formulating the question, where maybe the question isn't if or when Hamas is going to renounce one of its operational scopes. Maybe the question is, what is the implication of it? And what is the implication of doing both these things, yet wrapping it in the discursively wrapping it in the language of liberation? And once I did that, and that meant that of course, once you use the word colonial, post-colonial, settler colonial, liberation, you can't not engage with the wider literature that's there on the history of liberation movements, on post-colonial studies. And then you started realizing, wait a minute, the way in which Hamas is performing the nation that is forthcoming after the colonizer leaves yet also engaging in the resistance, in a resistance struggle that reminds us the colonizer is still there, is something that has been done globally, where in different levels, in different ways, and the post-colonial exists before the flight of the colonizer. And of course, as we know, you don't become liberated just the day the colonizer leaves. I mean, 300 years, 400 years of colonial rule in India, and I'm talking to you in English, right? And this is the language that I speak best in. So there is something about the anti-colonial continuing on after the flight of the colonizer, which then made me question, you know, what is it to be liberated? When are we liberated? And what is the role of or what is the importance of this flight of the colonizer that we celebrate every year with Independence Day? And the answer, of course, was in my book is that liberation is not a single moment; it's just long moment that is this weird psychological mix that begins long after the colonizer leaves, but begins long after before the colonizer leaves and continues on long after.
Excellent. And in a little bit, I'll ask you to kind of speak more about this kind of global context, but certainly there's also a kind of, you know, you mentioned Oslo, and there's that kind of quite immediate comparison that comes to my mind between, you know, what that tension between state building and liberation that Hamas is experiencing in Gaza, with the experience of the PLO in the 1990s and 2000s with the formation of the Palestinian Authority. So I was wondering if you saw any differences, or if there was any kind of comparison between the way Hamas understands or negotiates that tension compared to how the PLO or Fatah have negotiated, or to whatever extent they continue to negotiate that tension today in the West Bank, and whether kind of how you see those playing out differently if they play out differently.
Of course, Hamas sort of jumped into this puzzle, or was forced into this puzzle in 2000, or this tension in 2006, right? With the Palestinian Legislative Council elections, which everyone predicted Hamas would not win, right? But the mandate, the way Hamas sees itself, the mandate it sees itself embodying is one that brings in the liberation struggle, or the continuous insistence on resistance and the liberation struggle into the official structures and institutions of governance, right? So even the governance, as they put it, was done as a way to keep up a society that is able to resist. Now, discursively, this is very different to how Fatah officials in Gaza talked about governance versus resistance, as well as Fatah and PLO affiliated public officials in the West Bank talked about. So I've co-authored a second book on this sort of ritual of governance in the West Bank, where there in the context of Gaza, Fatah officials often mocked Hamas. Everything is about resistance with these people. Look at what they're doing with resistance, right? And they argue that there was an era of resistance, and whenever you talk to whether it was PA officials in the West Bank, or in the Gaza Strip, not PA officials but Fatah officials, they'd say that my history is that of a fighter. I was beside. In my book, I talk about a close associate of Yasser Arafat, who talks about how he was in Lebanon. He was fighting side by side with Arafat. He was fighting Israel. Yet that era had ended for them, which meant that, and while they didn't vocalize it in that way, the way the Palestinian Authority was talked about was that the crowning achievement of this generation, right? We used to wear fatigues before, now we wear a suit. That's the era that we're in now, and Hamas is engaging in some sort of anachronistic political action that doesn't make sense today. Of course, we know what the Oslo brand of statecraft becomes, right? I mean, how it manifests, as we've seen with the death of a prominent of Nizar Banat, and then the protests that followed, and the Palestinian Authority's conduct. I mean, that of course has a longer history of security cooperation and oppression. Hamas, I wouldn't say, still, that violence does also manifest in Hamas's operations. And in the book, I talk about the way Hamas, one of my interviewees was beat up, and the way they deal with opposition. So there is that aspect to it, which then, of course, I theorize in the book as not uncommon. If you look at the history of resistance organizations, they've been fairly brutal to other resistance organizations because they want to dominate the narrative of the resistance or the liberation struggle. Equally, though, Hamas also, even though it was talking about governance as resistance, the way it was carrying out, I didn't look at of course, the violence of Hamas is incredibly oppressive and it is, authoritarian, but it also shows you went back to my classical political science sociology training where, if you look at early state formation, it's the same thing. One of the things that Hamas did when it came to power in Gaza is took away guns from everyone. That's sort of the beginning of, the Tillian perspective of statecraft. So it was very interesting and fun for me to bring in these sort of classical understandings of what a state is and does to then apply to an organization like Hamas, which is, considered, universally contemptible and something that we can't study through these theoretical perspectives.
Thank you. And that kind of different temporality, I think, is interesting also because kind of these different temporalities that you're playing with in the kind of overall argument as a whole. And maybe that's something we can get back to in the Q&A, perhaps. But I also want to kind of pick up on that sort of unique contemptibility that you closed with, because I think one of the things that's so important about decolonizing Palestine is its focus on the Gaza Strip at a time when it feels like the sort of scope of discussion about dynamics in Palestine has been really narrowed to the West Bank and often just kind of Ramallah itself, right? And, there's this sort of vilification and essentialization of Gaza that takes place, whether it's equation with Hamas or its kind of reduction to a kind of war zone. And I think decolonizing Palestine really, by contrast, kind of shows it as a place where people live everyday lives and where politics happen, right? It's not kind of reducible in these ways. And I'm going to even kind of quote back to you, you kind of quote from your fieldwork diary in the book. You write, "This place is strange. Walking through the city, you forget where you are, and life seems normal. Curiously, Gaza City reminds me less of a place that is in a constant state of war and more of the urban centers of India that I have grown up loving, and in parentheses, and hating." And so I have a couple of questions that kind of arise out of this. One, just kind of generally, what are some of the important dynamics within Gaza that tend to be erased by this kind of reduction or flattening of Gaza into either a site of, quote unquote terrorism, or a site of victimhood, or a site kind of equated solely with Hamas, right? There's this kind of equation. So what are some of those kind of, you feel, the dynamics that get kind of erased by that? And then perhaps a kind of second question, which is how do the particular conditions of the Gaza Strip, Israel's siege, the kind of particular kind of density of population, the predominance of refugees among the population, how do those kind of particular conditions shape Hamas as a movement generally, and also perhaps kind of shape that tension, that central tension, right, between liberation and state building?
Yeah, I think talking about or writing about Hamas or Gaza particularly, and of course Hamas, was the most difficult aspect of this project in writing this book, because of the stigma that is associated with, we provide very limited vocabulary for how we are supposed to theorize a place like Gaza. One has to recognize that with the siege, access to Gaza has become incredibly limited, which means that there's almost a natural marginalization of conversations on Gaza that is unable to really getting to the nitty-gritties of what's happening in everyday life. And I've even had the experience, I think a couple of years after my fieldwork, of being at a conference in Austria, where I think everyone but me was Palestinian, and me, the Indian person, and I think one other person from Gaza were the only one talking about Gaza, right? So there's an obvious limitation there, but also this stigma that is associated with Hamas as an organization. And I forget who wrote about this, but someone talked about, but Hamas, where you could have a normal, reasonable conversation about Israel-Palestine, yet, when you say but Hamas, you sort of go into the realm of exceptional. And I personally experienced that, doing interviews in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I think I quote one of my interviewees who, claims to be liberal. And, at that time it was, what they were calling the knife intifada, Scissor intifada in Jerusalem. And he was in a very open way talking about what's happening in Jerusalem and the role of settlers in the occupied West Bank, and how that has led young Palestinians to, engage in these actions. And then when I tried to expand the conversation to Gaza, then it stopped. And he was like, no, well, that's a different conversation. They did it to themselves, and do you know about Hamas? So there's a politics to it, of course. If you treat Gaza and Hamas as exceptional, then you're also allowed to engage in exceptional action, right? So those that, there's a politics to framing Hamas and Gaza as a particularly contemptible organization. It can be a contemptible place because, it allows you to shape the narrative. And you saw that during the protest in Sheikh Jarrah, where from day one, you have the Israeli government and politicians talking about Hamas being involved. And of course, when Hamas did in fact become involved, and the conversation is completely shifted to what Hamas is or is not doing. And many of the mainstream discourse, of course, forgot about what was happening in Jerusalem. Equally, I think that seeing Gaza as particularly as exceptional as a place of victimhood, I feel like is also problematic, because then again, you are saying that the treatment of Gaza is exceptional because it's an exceptional place. And so on. I tried to, in the book, normalize Gaza. Part of that was, of course, through what you said, these sort of engaging in these everyday discussions and, with young Palestinians about life and, death and everything in between. But it's also, there's a history to it. Gaza, I would say, is a place where the dynamics of Israel-Palestine become most evident, because with the establishment of the state of Israel, it felt, and thereafter, and all the development thereafter, it felt the demographic effect of the establishment of the state of Israel, as well as the socioeconomic impact, political impact of things that followed. A demographic, because with the establishment of the state of Israel, with the Nakba, Gaza overnight became transformed to a place where a majority of the residents were refugees. So having felt the effect, the brutal effect of the establishment of the state of Israel in that way, having experienced the Nakba, it is no surprise then that Gaza has been the training ground for Palestinian revolutionary factions and figures, right? Even Edward Said talks about Gaza and Jerusalem being sort of the center of the Palestinian struggle. So it's a place that gives rise to resistance organization. It's a place that gives rise to intifadas. It's a place where you see the Great March, right? So in that sense, what Gaza is very much normal in its conduct, in its indomitability in terms of an anti-colonial struggle. Even Israel's treatment of Gaza, I would say, is normal because of how indomitable Gaza has been in its anti-colonial struggle. If we understand Israel as Israel's settler, the logic of Israel's settler colonial project, which denies the existence of Palestine and Palestinians by continuously fighting, by continuously starting uprisings, by engaging in the Great March. It is the loudest sort of counterpoint to that narrative, to the settler narrative of the non-existence of the indigenous, right? So of course, so it's not surprising that Israel has been, the nature of Israel's campaign. We've also had several quotes of, Israeli military officials, politicians having deep hatred for Gaza. But by normalizing Hamas, or by normalizing Gaza and talking about it, in sort of normal terminology of liberation, post-colonial studies, then opens it up, right? Allows us to draw on theoretical perspective, engaging in methodological approaches that don't have to stick to those old tropes of terrorism, political Islamism. Of course, one of doing field work, that was my push to break out of that narrative. I was asked to do desk work, and I was told that if I go to Gaza, if something happens, the department is not responsible, which isn't true, by the way. I called the insurance company and I was covered. But nonetheless, I think that normalizing Gaza and normalizing Hamas allows us to talk about it in different ways and have a different theoretical toolbox for understanding what's happening in Gaza and what Hamas is doing.
And I think that de-exceptionalization, is important for kind of Palestine as a whole, but particularly for Gaza in the ways that you point out. And you note in the book that kind of one of its objectives, right, is to kind of globalize Hamas. Again, to quote you back to yourself, if you don't mind, to explicate its politics in terms of the global experience of anti-colonial struggles, post-colonial states, and conceptions of being liberated and unliberated that go beyond the particularity of Palestine. And you draw on, quite a few different comparisons from, Algeria to Zimbabwe, which has a nice kind of alphabetical, comprehensiveness to it. So I'm kind of curious if you could say a bit more about which of those comparisons you found particularly generative for thinking about Hamas, and perhaps also how Hamas might help us understand other kind of liberation movements and post-colonial states, right? So thinking also of Palestine as a kind of a generative site for understanding, places beyond its borders.
In the book, of course, it's the final product. So you say, a nice way, I want to globalize Hamas. But Palestine was introduced to me in a very global context, primarily because my undergraduate supervisor at the age of 18, I'm 36, so 18 years ago, my first supervisor as an undergraduate student at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York was John Collins, who wrote this book called Global Palestine, which came out quite a few years later. Nonetheless, my introduction to Palestine, I went to college to study physics and, what did I tell the visa officer? Physics and economics, because I said that was a good, to convince them I was going to come back to India afterwards. Nonetheless, so John was one of my, first supervisors, and he was a global studies professor, and he introduced Palestine in this sort of global context of, liberation movements, revolutionary struggles. So it was quite settled then. Of course, as the years went by, as we've seen in the last 10 years, there's so much work on sort of Palestine from a global perspective. People, especially with folks that are, writing very interesting stuff about, settler colonialism and looking at Palestine as one of these global sites of settler colonialism. And that, of course, helped me and encouraged me as I was working through this. But then I also noticed that, while these sort of global perspectives were regularly applied to Israel-Palestine in general, no one was doing that with Hamas. So I think that was the goal of normalizing Hamas. Of course, that's also normalizing and globalizing and then globalizing Hamas. That's also, of course, for a lot of people, the most provocative aspect of the work of my work, because by attaching Hamas or placing Hamas alongside anti-colonial violence struggles around the world, or post-colonial statecraft around the world, what I'm doing is I'm breaking through that stigma, and I'm comparing Hamas to liberation movements that, you know, retroactively we've sanctified as a good thing, right? And through Hamas, what I wanted to show, by being able to apply these theoretical perspectives, by looking at the idiosyncrasies and that line the path to liberation, I wanted to bring that understanding of liberation down from the pedestal, and to let people know, or to let readers know, that, well, what Hamas is doing is something that has been done historically. Of course, post fact, you say that, you know, of course, it was the Indian liberation movement was a good thing, and Gandhi was a good person, and Martin Luther King was a good person. But nonetheless, these idiosyncrasies have always existed in liberation struggles, right? And one of the things that I think was, you know, you asked what comparison was most generative. I think the comparison that was most difficult to make and most difficult to sort of sell to people was not looking at the religious aspect of Hamas's military functions, and not talking about Islamism, not using the terrorism studies frameworks, and sort of directly connected to like a Fanon or connected to anti-colonial armed struggles around the world. I think that was the most, I think that provoked some people. I've been made aware of that. I think the other generative aspect, I think is the introduction of post-colonial, or the post-colonial statecraft within the context of, you know, an ongoing liberation struggle. I think that to some people was problematic, because then am I taking away from the fact that Hamas or Palestine is under settler colonial rule by introducing the post? But of course, there, I believe that introducing the post-colonial alongside the anti-colonial gives us something, an additional framework for understanding how liberation happens, but also understanding the genealogy of liberation, the confusions, the idiosyncrasies, and how difficult it is, as I argue at the end of the last final chapter, how difficult it is to conjure up this sense of indigeneity when you've gone through 100, 200, 300 years of colonial rule, where the very project was to erase that indigeneity, which is even more serious in a settler colonial condition.
So I think in responding to that question, I just want to remind people to submit questions to the Q&A function, and we've already started to receive a few questions. So I have a few more questions, but I'll turn to the Q&A now. And if there's time, maybe I can ask questions. But the first question, you have kind of touched on it in the remarks you just gave. It comes from one of our graduates from the Middle East Studies program here at Brown, Anshita Dasgupta. So she asks, or she says, thank you so much for writing this wonderful book that not only helps to de-exceptionalize Hamas and Gaza, but also extends this critical framework, questioning the simplistic transition from the colonial to the post-colonial. Do you see Gaza under Hamas as a post-colonial state? Then, given your critiques about the statist behaviors manifested by Hamas officials policing entry into Gaza, which I think you suggest is colonial behavior, how do you reconcile colonial behaviors by anti-colonial actors in a post-colonial state? Do you believe there can ever exist a state that is fully post-colonial? Do you think it might make sense or more sense to theorize on post-colonialism in terms of incidental actions that are resisting the colonial rather than a view to view the post-colonial as a tangible period and space after colonialism.
Okay, leave it to a fellow Bengali to ask this weighty question. I don't believe Gaza is a post-colonial state per se. I believe that the Oslo Accords introduced post-coloniality and introduced the rituals, institutions, and structures of the post-colonial state as a way of changing the subjective identity of the liberation faction, as a way of transforming them from being liberation factions to bureaucrats, right? That, of course, helps in undermining the Palestinian resistance movement, undermining the Palestinian liberation. So in that way, the Hamas is engaging in these rituals of post-coloniality, which is, normally done, has been seen done in other colonial contexts, with maybe not as institutionalized as the case in Hamas, with Hamas and Gaza, but in other places, and I think in the book I talk about in India, where revolutionary factions within university dorms would run the dorm like it's a country and like it's a state, right? As a way of proving that to themselves and to the other, or to the colonizer, that we are a community that deserves liberation. And Hamas would do that same thing by ritually engaging in these sorts of state-like behavior. It would argue, or they would argue, they have said in the interviews with me that they wanted to show, they say that we don't exist. By engaging in these rituals, by, I had to sign out, or I had to register my journey out of Gaza, which is interesting because you go into the office and you have to register it. The Hamas officials have no control over it. And then they asked me, so how did you come in, through the tunnel or through the border? Which, I mean, the formalizing the informality of it is it's something else. But it's a way of showing that they say we don't exist, but here we're showing that we exist. We are a people, and we exist, right? Can there be a truly post-colonial state? I don't think so. I think I end up with this sort of very grim conclusion that the struggle for liberation is such, or the experience of colonial rule is such, that it works to wipe out any memory of indigeneity that we may have had. So there's no way, as the name suggests, post-colonial. Colonial is going to be perpetually stuck with us because we don't have, history. History doesn't necessarily work with course correction, right? Indians can't just forget those 300 years of history and become Indians as we were before the onset of colonial rule. So we are compelled to live with this legacy of colonial, which is, that's not a criticism. And this is something I've struggled with formally. That's not a criticism of anti-colonial struggle. That's not a criticism of the political actions of the colonized people. It's more of a damning assessment of what colonialism is and what it does to a people. And so I end with the book saying that we will, we're compelled to perpetually fight for liberation from something or the other, to find that indigenous identity, which we don't have a memory of. Wow, that's grim, vocalizing, yeah.
Actually, this leads me to the first question that was posed by Scott Sunshine. So I'm going to kind of read his question and then kind of perhaps, because I think it connects to this question of like not being able to turn back the clock in some ways. So Scott asked, could not Hamas normalize, which is to say, allow the refugees to settle? Gaza was Egyptian and is now Egyptian, so why can it not become a regular state? Similarly, when Jordan controlled the West Bank, why did they not settle the refugees, which would have not allowed for the current situation? So I think, perhaps in addressing that, you could also maybe say something about the way refugee and non-refugee relations in Gaza. Is that a distinction that continues to kind of play out in particular ways? Does that And if so, how?
I think that that wasn't the focus of my project, right? So I didn't demographically separate that. But and most of the people that I interviewed were of a refugee background, right? So so that mindset of the refugee and of the struggle to return back home was constantly there. Even folks who've never set foot on the other on their old town in Jaffa would say things like, this is just temporary. One day I'm going to go back home. Or you would almost forget that neither he or his father had ever set foot in Jaffa. So it's hard for me to distinguish that the difference between the refugee and the non-refugee. With regards to sort of the broader, what you're indicating or talking about is the broader sort of regional politics of it, right? So I would argue, I'm not an expert on Jordanian politics or Egyptian politics, but I can tell you from the Egyptian perspective, Hamas in Gaza has played a very important role in mobilizing political sentiments within the country. So when I was in Gaza, it was this brief period on the Morsi when Gaza was opened up. And I left Gaza a week before the Morsi government fell. In fact, I was supposed to stay for 2 more weeks, but then I was told there was a big protest and the Morsi government was going to fall. And during that time, what had happened is that Gaza and Hamas and Gazans were being continuously demonized in the Egyptian media, where Egypt's energy crisis. So when the week before I left Gaza, the week that I left Gaza and I was in Egypt, there was a massive energy crisis. There were lines for gas outside the petrol pump and so on and so forth. So discursively, Gaza and Palestine plays a very important role. It gives regional powers, regional actors a bargaining chip when it comes to movements in the region. So Gaza gives Egypt a massive role in regional politics and the politics of Israel-Palestine, because Egypt is the one willing to negotiate with Hamas or having conversations with Hamas. When necessary, equally, Jordan, brings up its presence or its role in regional politics to negotiate terms with Israel. So in some ways, I think allowing the refugees to normally become citizens would take away that factor. But I think that framing the question in that way also minimizes, what Palestinians want, right? I think Palestinians, besides the political movements of these big powers, I think Palestinians don't want to be settled in Jordan or in Egypt. They would say that Gaza is our land, so is the occupied West Bank, and so is Jerusalem, and so is parts of Israel, what is mainland Israel today. So I think that if we give a little bit of agency to the perspective of Palestinians, I think this sort of solution, wouldn't necessarily solve the problem.
Thank you. Another question from Suvaid Yassin. Hi, Somdeep. Thank you so much for your talk. Very enlightening. I was wondering, what if you also thought about parallels between Gaza, Palestine, Hamas vis-a-vis resistance to the Indian occupation in Kashmir? In so many ways, Kashmir is de-exceptionalizing by India as a zone of conflict or as a zone of Islamic fundamentalism, instead of a genuine liberation movement for self-determination, is quite similar to the Israeli narrative around occupied Palestine. And more so recently, in an imminent threat of settler colonial control post the events of August 2019 in Kashmir.
Yeah. Thank you, Yassin, for that. In some ways, what's happening in Kashmir or the role of India in Kashmir was, very much central to central motivating factor in my research in Palestine. So I think, they're not just some parallels. There's a lot of parallels. There is sort of a solidarity, the global solidarity between Palestinians and Kashmiris. They both see themselves as fighting for liberation, and of course the closer relationship. You have to also contextualize, what's happening in Kashmir vis-a-vis Palestine with the changing relationship between Israel and India. And under the Hindu nationalist government, this relationship has become incredibly close, where similar narratives, technologies, and tactics are being used in Kashmir. And the kind of that, so there is solidarity between Palestinians and Kashmiris. Actually, Kashmiris also use the term intifada. And recently, earlier this year, I believe, Kashmiris were arrested for showing solidarity with Palestinians. That's there. And then there is the closer relationship between Israel and India that goes into not just the material relationship, so technology is crowd control, sort of military and strategic time, but also how under the Hindu nationalist government and how until recently Netanyahu, they saw each other, their role, discursively, they saw each other in the globe. While Israel would always say that they are the only democracy in the Middle East, surrounded by these non-democratic, this sort of oasis, right? India would say the same thing, right? Where they would say that we are sort of the bastion of democracy and civilization, and forward thinking in this region. All these other countries, including Pakistan, are sort of, similar to these Middle Eastern countries, right? So there's a discursive sort of connection there as well. So yeah.
Excellent. And please continue to put questions in the Q&A function. We still have about 10 minutes left. So I'll kind of pick up perhaps on some of the questions that I had. And I was struck, again, kind of in the book, the emphasis on reading Palestine within the context of the global South. So I think some of these questions really kind of pick up on that, right? That the productivity of South-South connections, whether as sites of comparisons or as a route for kind of traveling theory. And in the final chapter on liberation, you talk a bit about traveling to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and about the different conditions of colonialism and the different kinds of hierarchies that exist there, and about your positionality as an Indian within those different kinds of histories and hierarchies. So I'm just maybe curious about how this perspective, this approach, these experiences have shaped your understanding of this idea of decolonizing, right? And I guess this gets back in some ways kind of to Anchita's question. And maybe are there, without kind of, asking you to kind of totally kind of change the rather sober assessment of the kind of prospects for decolonization, right? But are there ways in which kind of shifting our perspective about decolonization can also be a kind of an act that leads us more closely towards decolonizing? And in the sense of, I take it that kind of the title of your book is a sort of double entendre, right? That part of decolonizing Palestine is about taking it out, putting it in a framework that allows it to kind of be de-exceptionalized, putting it in this kind of broader framework, a kind of global South, global decolonization kind of framework. So is there kind of hope in that sense? Am I trying too hard to kind of pull something positive here?
No, I don't think so. I think you are right. I think yeah, maybe I was in a bad mood and I just sort of concluded that there is no end to this, right? But I guess I definitely didn't intend it to. I didn't think about it about a book where I'm going to talk about South-South connections. It just sort of made sense to draw on if once you formulate this to be a liberation struggle. I think that's the biggest sort of hurdle, right? When you're talking about an organization like Hamas, if you see it as part of a liberation struggle, then it just sort of made sense to then jump around. I understand how arrogant, and you read out all the from Algeria to Zimbabwe. I mean, people spend their lifetime reading about these places, and I just sort of jam-packed that in one chapter. But in some ways, I also through the book wanted to show how an organization like Hamas could be studied, right? And by connecting Hamas, and we have the opportunity to connect Hamas, connect Palestine to these sort of historical trajectories, to really think about what liberation is and when it happens and to what extent, right? And I think rather than maybe the last chapter, rather than arguing, that my experience in Tanzania told me that there was no liberation, maybe it reminded me more of the fact of how long and convoluted the process of decolonization really is. And we talk about decolonization a lot, right? But the colonial endeavor was such that it embedded every aspect of our lives. So to be able to get rid of that, it requires a multi-sided, multi-pronged effort, right? So rather than, if, now you've convinced me to be positive, rather than saying there is no hope, it's to be cautious of how broad the struggle to decolonize really is. And, in the book, I use Fanon a lot, right? And people often, when they say decolonization, Fanon, they stick to violence, right? That's sort of what everyone uses. But what you forget is the life story of Fanon that led to Wretched of the Earth. And you go back to his earlier writings where he's struggling with his Blackness and, his, longing for whiteness, tells you how much of an internal struggle it really is to liberate, to decolonize. And so maybe decolonization is not impossible, but it requires a broad effort that many don't realize what that entails, right?
Yeah, certainly. I think a lot to think about and a lot to a lot of work to do, just in terms of kind of coming to grips with the extent of colonization, let alone kind of get ourselves on the path of decolonization. Another question from Suvaid. We have a sense of how so many movements globally are aware of the Palestinian struggle and lend solidarity in their own ways. In your interviews, in your fieldwork, what sense did you get about the Palestinian resistance's awareness of movements elsewhere? Did they mention examples from elsewhere in a way of kind of de-exceptionalizing their own movement?
Sure, I think there was, when people heard that I was from India, and going back to your previous question, Yassine, the automatic discussion was of Kashmir and how I looked at what's happening in Kashmir and India's relation to Israel. So yes, there's definitely an awareness. And I think that is, what has been great about the last 10 years of Palestine studies, right? You've had these young, very competent Palestinian scholars showing us the ways in which the Palestinian struggle is normalizing it, seeing connections globally, which has allowed the Palestinian flag to show up in Black Lives Matter movement. So, these sorts of, so I think that Palestinian scholars, Palestinian activists, Palestinian public intellectuals have engaged in a conscious struggle to break Palestine out of that exceptional scope and talk about, hey, you remember those liberation struggles, you remember the Gandhis and the Martin Luther Kings and Malcolm X's. I mean, we're in that same line. It's a different time, And but look, and we can theorize, what's happening in Palestine with using theoretical perspectives that we're used to understand settler colonialism in Australia or Canada or South Africa, right? So I think there is more, and there's a conscious effort to do this, constant effort to normalize what's happening.
Absolutely. And did you feel like that's something I feel globally, but you felt that on the ground in Gaza as well?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it was very interesting for me to navigate Gaza because I didn't look like a, white European diplomat. At that time, I think it was only Norwegians and Swiss who had sort of a diplomatic presence. So I was, and also being the color of my skin meant that I wasn't visibly a foreigner, but it also created this camaraderie with many young Palestinians my age who I still keep in touch with, and come to my wedding and all of that, where we talk about Palestine in a global landscape, where we talked about what happened in the Indian independence movement, what happened in Kashmir, what happened in Algeria, how Palestine. So we would engage in these very long discussions, their relationship with Israel, how Israeli products are flooding the market and have flooded the market in Gaza, and what that does to you, to use Israeli money, while you're engaging in this liberation struggle against Israel. So there was, at least, in my discussion, there was an awareness and conscious thinking about the globe when talking about Palestine.
Excellent. Unless there are any other questions, I'll kind of give a rambling close to give others the opportunity to pose a final question. But I just want to thank you, Som. This was a really enriching conversation and excellent book, and so much to think about. Questions, for I think the future, and ways of thinking about how Palestine fits into our ways of understanding colonialism, anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, and all the ways in which those bleed together, as we've addressed today. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all of those who joined on Zoom and joined via the live cast on YouTube. And we hope to see you again at our further events through the Center for Middle East Studies.